Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with thought leaders such as Kevin Kelly, Brad Feld, Steve Blank, Gretchen Rubin, Tim Harford, Adam Grant, Tim O'Reilly, Tyler Cowan, and many, many more on topics that will help you gain a distinct advantage, not only in the world of creativity and innovation, but in your entire professional and personal life. Each and every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some short, high-impact and easily digestible insights to have you finishing your week on a high. Future Squared is powered by Collective Campus, a corporate innovation school, consultancy, and startup accelerator that works with large organizations to help them unlock their people's often latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning those ideas into reality, creating a culture of innovation, or partnering with startups, visit collectivecampus.io. So without further ado, let's get into today's podcast.
Welcome back to Future Squared. Today I bring you Alex Hutchinson. Alex is an award-winning journalist who writes about the science of endurance for Runner's World and Outside, and frequently contributes to other publications such as the New York Times and the New Yorker. A former long-distance runner for the Canadian national team, he holds a master's in journalism from Columbia and a Ph.D. in physics from Cambridge, and he did his post-doctoral research with the National Security Agency. He's just released his third book, Endure: Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance, which has been praised by the likes of Malcolm Gladwell simply as amazing. As somebody who has always experimented with different ways to optimize my own physical and mental condition, I really enjoyed this conversation with Alex and trust that you will learn a lot from it, including 1. The false dichotomy of body and mind, 2. What our limit breakers are, 3. How to expand those limits, 4. Which is better, high-fat diets or carbo loading? And 5. A number of memorable stories of human triumph over self-imposed walls. You'll learn that and a hell of a lot more in this conversation with the one and only Alex Hutchinson.
Welcome to the show, Alex.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, and I think I'd say that you're the fourth or the fifth guest to join us all the way from Toronto, Canada.
Oh wow! Well, yeah, I can say it's a beautiful day here. It's about minus 10, and we just got about 15 centimeters of snow, so it's a very Canadian kind of day.
Wow, that's such a foreign concept for someone who's been born and raised in Melbourne, Australia. And it's funny, the other week I was having a conversation with someone from Nebraska who's trying to get me out there to speak at a conference. And this was a Skype call, video call, and he moved the camera and he said, "Look outside my window," and there was this big frozen over lake, and I was like, wow, that's just, I don't know what to do with that.
It's a different world. And I will say I actually lived in Sydney for 4 years and Canberra for a little bit. So I do have a sense. I experienced 43 degrees Celsius when I was there. So yeah. I've seen both ends.
Yeah. What brought you to Australia?
My wife was studying medicine at the University of Sydney.
Makes sense. Well, Alex, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. Listeners of the show will know I am a big advocate or a big experimenter when it comes to different, say, methods of physical training and when it comes to different forms of cognitive enhancement. So I'm excited to dig into today's topic around endurance. And on that point, congratulations on the release of your third book, Endure: Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance, which came out this week.
Yeah, it's been an exciting few days, and it's been a long. Speaking of endurance, it's been a long journey getting this book to the point of publication. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, and I imagine you'd be embarking on a bit of a virtual book tour this week, appearing on a lot of podcasts and things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting how things change. Right now, podcasts are the medium of choice. Really, people are really digging that medium. So I've had a chance to speak with a bunch of people. And podcasts can really find their own niche of dedicated listeners. So different kinds of podcasts, whether it's for entrepreneurs or for endurance athletes and so on.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this topic of endurance and performance, I mean, oftentimes we ground it in athletics, but it can extend to all types of performance, whether that's in the workplace or just performance in life. And one thing that I really like about the book is that it offers something for anyone who's interested in health, athleticism, neuroscience, the human condition, and so on. And I guess before we dig in a little deeper, maybe we'll take a step back. I mean, how do you define endurance, Alex?
Yeah, so after lots of sort of thought about this, and this started out as a running book, and it became broader and broader as I got into the topic of endurance. So the definition I ended up with is that endurance is the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop. So it's a very broad definition that encompasses that feeling that you really want to stop, but you're overcoming that desire and continuing.
Yeah, and that's a interesting. I'll use that as a segue because there's a hell of a lot of literature, especially in the self-help world, around mind over matter. You can do it. It's just your mind telling you can't do it. How much of endurance is mind over matter, and how much of it is a little bit more tangible than that?
Yeah, so that's the $1 million question, and I certainly have been. I've always been resistant to the simple idea that it's mind over matter, and I've kind of been dragged screaming against my will into the realization that the mind is actually more important than I realized when I was a young athlete, for example, thinking that it was all about my VO2 max. Quantifying how much is mind and how much is matter, in some ways you have to be very specific about with the context. So if you ask me, if you take a random sample of the population and say we're going to have a race, and how much is the finishing order going to depend on body versus mind, I would say it's mostly body. It's 99% body. That's going to determine who's going to win that race. But if you then say let's go to the Olympic final and try and figure out who's going to win a race among people who already all have similar physical attributes, it's almost all mind. So depending on which group of people you're looking at, the balance shifts. And I think when it comes down to personal limits, when I'm asking, am I getting the most out of myself? What are my limits? Then within that context, again, I think the mind becomes a more dominant force, because, of course, when I'm just talking about myself and my personal limits, the physical is kind of set. Of course, training and things like that matter, but that's the ultimate waffling answer. I realize and the refusal to give a set number, but it really depends on the context. And I think that the mind is as we can get into more, it does have a quantifiable, measurable role in determining what feel like physical limits.
And I guess just building on that point, I mean, in psychology, there's the whole notion of the mind-brain dichotomy, but fundamentally, from reading your book, it seems more to me that that's a false dichotomy, and that the brain and the body are intertwined. And to understand what defines your limits, you have to consider them both together.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of the parallel I think of is the nature versus nurture debate in genetics. And if you press someone who really knows about these sorts of topics on this question, they'll be like, you can't answer nature versus nurture, because in a sense your nature is defined by your nurture and vice versa. They influence each other. And it's the same with mind versus body and endurance. What your mind is telling you, it depends on what's going on in your body and the capacities of your body. And what your body is capable of is in very real ways a function of what your brain says it's capable of. So it's one, it's the other, it's both. And what's really interesting, I think, is figuring out in different contexts how the mind and body kind of fit together and where one kind of takes precedence over the other.
Yeah. And I mean, on that point, your book is broken up into a number of sections around limits, breaking limits, and so on. And I guess on the limits themselves, you've looked at that false dichotomy, I guess I'll call it, and you've talked about things like pain, muscle, oxygen, heat, thirst, and fuel as very real physical elements that come into the equation insofar as endurance is concerned. And your book does have a treasure trove of stories and anecdotes around real-world situations where either pain or muscle or heat were the key sort of differentiator. So I guess I'm keen to explore some of these, particularly the story of Tom Boyle.
Yeah, so Tom Boyle is he stands in for a whole class of stories that we've all heard. The stories of the guy or the woman or the girl or the whoever who sees someone pinned under a car and in that moment of supreme life and death fear lifts the car up and allows the person to be safe. Tom Boyle was the guy in Tucson, Arizona, who saw a cyclist get hit by a car and pinned under the wheels of a Chevy Camaro, and the Chevy Camaro has a wheel weight or a curb weight of about 1,400 kilograms, depending on the year. And he went and lifted it up, and someone was able to pull this cyclist out from under the tires. And this was witnessed by a bunch of people, and it's one of those classic conundrums that scientists in the lab are like, yeah, well, this is how strong humans can get. But then there's all these stories. Every year there'll be another story of someone who does something that's seemingly impossible. So there's the name that we give to this is hysterical strength. This idea that we're going to have if it really push comes to shove, you can access this hidden reserve of strength, the full measure of your muscular capacity. Yeah. So I spent a long time digging into the research on this, and it's really tricky to figure out because there's these great Soviet era experiments where they were trying to figure out with their weightlifters whether there was hidden capacity that they could access, and they concluded that most of us only use about 65% of our maximum strength, and trained weightlifters might get up to 80%, and then in a big competition like the Olympics might get up to 90%. But it's not clear whether these were. I actually got in touch with one of the old Soviet researchers. He's in his mid 80s now, and said, "Where did you get these numbers? How did you come up with these estimates?" And he's like, "I don't remember." I was like, "Well, okay, you're 85. I'll let it pass." But when I talk to other scientists, they're skeptical about whether for a single lift, whether we really have a whole lot of reserve left over. When they do experiments with electric shocks, trying to see how strong is the muscle when we zap it with electricity versus when you just try and exert it voluntarily, there's not a whole lot left in reserve for a single lift. But when you start looking at endurance, when you start looking at longer sustained efforts, that's when the brain starts to play a bigger and bigger role.
Yeah, and I guess that's when this whole notion of facing the wall as a runner comes into play, because you've been running for X amount of kilometers or miles, and you've still got so much to go. Whereas with a lift, especially with, say, powerlifting, it's just an explosive thing where, hey, it could be done in 10 seconds. It could be a big deadlift or a clean and jerk or something along those lines, where you just need to dig deep mentally just for that, say, 1 minute where you psych yourself up and you do that lift. Whereas with running, it could be, say, a 2 hour, well, sub 2 hour, hopefully in the near future marathon, but it could be, say, a 4 hour or 5 hour marathon.
Yeah. So there's definitely a big difference. I mean, there is interesting research, even with, if you're doing, let's say, a series of maximum weightlifts, the number that you think you have to do, even if you're told, okay, I want you to go all out for six lifts, and you'll get a rest between, and just go all out, each one. Don't save anything. Just see how much force you can exert for those 6 lifts. You'll have a sort of quote unquote finishing kick where the 6th one will be stronger than the 5th one. So we kind of pace ourselves even when we're trying not to, even in such short efforts where you really think pacing wouldn't be a factor. But it definitely gets to be a bigger and then eventually a dominant factor by the time you get to something like a marathon. There's always this situation where it's like, anyone who's run a marathon knows how terrible it feels after 30K. But the simple truth is, if a lion jumped out from behind the nearest tree 30K into a marathon, almost everybody would be able. I would say everybody who's at the 30K point of a marathon would discover that they can actually go faster. There's more in their muscles, but it's their mind that's like, whoa, buddy, you've got 12K to go. Just keep it relaxed, and I'm going to make it feel like you're at your limits, even if you're not.
Yeah, I like that concept of the finishing kick as well, and I think it applies outside of the athletic domain as well. I mean, currently in our team, we're testing this concept of 3-month years, where you might have your annual goals, and people just in the last couple of months of the year, they really dig deep to hit those targets. And it's like, well, why are we only digging deep in the last 2 months of the year? Why can't we dig deep throughout the year? Now, of course, there's something to be said about, is that sustainable and whatnot? But having 3-month years where you've got these quarterly targets and you've got a number of tasks you want to, I suppose, deliver by that time, forces people to, I suppose, try and have that mentality of digging deep more often throughout the year rather than just at the end. And I guess the same would apply in, say, basketball, where, the last 5 minutes, people are just super, super focused. And, the last 5 minutes go for about half an hour, mind you. But that's another story. I just really like that concept. And, what you said there about 6 lifts, the 6th one, you're going to find that extra kick. And also with what you've said there, around whether it was the lion jumping out of the trees or whether it was Tom Boyle lifting the car off the cyclist, it all seems that it comes back to purpose. And when I had this conversation with Brad Stolberg, who I know interviewed you recently, he was saying that purpose is the world's greatest performance enhancer.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to go back for a second to your point about finishing kicks, it's like even on a very, very microcycle, I have this terrible, terrible habit that I sit at a computer most of the day. I work from home. I have fairly flexible time. I have to manage my time in order to get everything done. But at the end of the day, I've got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old kid, and the caregiver leaves at 5:30, and it's me. I'm on duty at 5:30. Yep. And it is this terrible and invariable habit that at about 5:10, I'll be like, I'll finally get rolling. I will get 30% of my day's work done in the last 20 minutes. I'm like, if I could bottle that a little bit, if I could instill some of that sense of like, okay, the thoughts that are in my head, I have to get them down now because they're going to disappear if I don't get them down. If I could spread that out over the day, I would become sort of this Nietzschean Superman, far more productive. And so, like you said, like the idea of a 3-month year, you have to find ways of either tricking yourself or of just setting different benchmarks. And although it's tricky though, one of the stories I tell in my book is of when I was a middle distance runner, and focusing on 1,500 meters, and I tried to move up to 5,000 meters, and I found it hard to sustain my focus for that longer race. And so I would try to tell myself, okay, instead of 5,000 meters, you're only running 4,000 meters. Don't worry about the last kilometer. Don't sort of save up and then sprint in the last kilometer. But it's hard to override those internal templates. So you have to find ways of getting past the sort of knowledge of when the real deadline is. It's sort of like setting your watch 5 minutes early so you'll never be late for anything. After a while, you kind of build that into your mental calculations.
Yeah, and the whole concept of tricking your brain is something you cover in the book as well. And a couple of things that jumped out, which I found interesting, was when people would say swish a carbohydrate drink and then just spit it out, and it would trick their mind into thinking that they actually drank that drink and they'd get an energy boost. Or when an athlete's performance improves, when a thermometer is doctored to read the temperature a few degrees cooler than it actually is, so they think, oh, it's not that hot, so I'll just keep, my body temperature is not that hot, so I'll keep going. So I found that quite interesting as well.
Yeah, to me that's both really interesting research and also sort of funny research. I just get a kick out of imagining these scientists in the lab just saying like, how are we going to mess with our subjects today? We're gonna mess up the thermometers. We're gonna give them clocks that read slow. We're gonna lie to them about how far they've been going. But these things actually work. Like you said, like the thermometer, it's not that heat isn't real. Of course, anyone who's been through 40 degrees Celsius knows that you can't exercise as hard or for as long. But part of that is because it feels harder. And if you can get over the expectation that it's going to be harder, then it's somewhere sort of halfway in the middle where, there's physiological effects, but it's not quite as much. And so one of the sort of powerful things that I came across, how do you apply this in your life? Well, not most of us don't have a coach of any description, and if we do, it's not a coach who can lie to us every week to trick us. That doesn't work. But there are ways of kind of convincing yourself that you're capable of more than you might expect. And something that I came across from a few different people I spoke to was this idea. So Amby Burfoot is a guy. He won the Boston Marathon back in 1968, and then was a longtime Runner's World editor, a really sort of deep thinker on the topic of endurance. And he said that the best workout you could possibly do if you want to become a better runner is you do 5 times a mile as hard as you can, and then when you're finished, your coach says, do another one at the same pace. And you're like, that's impossible. But if you trust your coach, you try it, and you discover that you can do one more. And so you learn that you're capable of more than you thought. Yeah. And I think that kind of principle, again, we don't always have a coach, tricking us like that, but I always feel like I try and set myself a goal that's in that sweet spot of achievable, hard but achievable. And if I can get there, then I can always try and push farther once I'm there. But finding ways of not setting goals that are too easy or too hard, and giving yourself room to discover that you're capable of more than you might have thought at the outset.
Yeah, and that whole notion of being told or of running the extra mile when you didn't think you could, I guess that fosters belief. And so that when you are called to action, when you do feel like, oh man, I just can't keep going, but you can recall that time or all those times that you did the extra mile, and you know that, well, maybe it's just your mind telling you can't, and that physically you are capable of it. So your book also explores that concept of belief and whether belief's enough. And I guess belief is one of those things, again, that comes back to the whole world of self-help gurus. You just got to believe, the secret, positive thinking, but belief without action isn't enough. So keen to explore one of the stories you tell in the book. I actually thought I wrote the name down, but it was to do with the 10-mile cherry blossom run you did in 2003,
Oh, yeah.
where you caught up to the Kenyan and won a whopping $250.
Yeah. Well, okay, I can tell that story. So in terms of the idea of belief, like you said, you can tell yourself that all I got to do is believe. You can tell yourself that from morning till night, and that it doesn't really just sort of telling yourself or being told that doesn't do anything if you don't have reason to believe. You have to show yourself that what you believe is actually possible. And one of the sort of experiences that drove that home to me is I was a competitive distance runner for many years, and first on the track and stuff, but eventually I tried some road racing. And road racing is a very different world because you're not racing for personal bests, you're racing to try and basically make some money. In road racing, there's this sort of mad dash for the money. And so there was one race I ran in 2003. It was a big 10-miler in Washington, D.C. called Cherry Blossom, and there were about 25 runners in the elite category, and 24 of them were East African, mostly from Kenya, and then there was me. And there's just a very different approach. Some of those runners were people I knew I should be capable of running with and maybe beating, but all of the runners in the lead pack, they followed the leader. So the fastest runners went out very fast, and everyone went with the front runners. Whereas I was thinking, I need to pace myself. I'm not capable of going out. I'm not capable of winning this race, so I shouldn't run with the leaders. I should run very carefully. And so of the 24 runners in the lead pack, I ended up catching about half of them. I ended up in 12th place, and there was money for 12 spots. So I won like $200 or $250. I can't remember. And I was thinking, boy, I'm so great. I'm so smart at pacing myself, within my limits and not pushing too far. But then I realized that, I looked at the results of some of the people around me, and I realized, I ran a safe race. But if I run safe races every week, I'm never going to, have a big breakthrough running way beyond my abilities. Whereas some of the other guys around me, even guys that I beat, a month later, they would have a race where they would just knock it out of the park because they had the confidence to go out and run with the leaders and try again, to accept some failure now and then, but to set their sights higher. And the reason they had confidence comes from the running culture they were in, where they're training with the best athletes in the world, in their hometowns in Kenya. They all know people who've been successful at the highest level. So they think, why not me? I can do it too. Whereas for me, it seemed like a much bigger leap to gain that belief. I didn't have the same, we might have had the same sort of race times for the most part, but I had a hard time building that belief within myself. And so, I used to laugh at the runners who would go out with the leaders and then fade. But I've sort of come to think that sometimes there's a space, there's a role for being really ambitious when giving yourself a chance to fail, but also giving yourself a chance to succeed in a bigger way than you might otherwise.
Yeah, and the book, like you said, does make reference to Kenyan runners who just have that self-belief because they've more or less been fostered by a long-standing international dominance of generations of Kenyan runners, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I guess on the concept of belief as well, I'm not sure how closely you follow mixed martial arts, but everybody talks about Conor McGregor and how he's got this unwavering belief when he's in the octagon, and he might have someone on top of him just piling punches down, but he'll be talking back the whole time, in his Irish accent. He's just like talking crap, and they're thinking, why is this guy talking crap, and why is he not covering up? And that then seeds this self-doubt in his opponents and in his adversaries, and more often than not, he comes out on top.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that, like you said, it creates self-doubt in them, but it also allows him to persist in a sport where the urge to tap out is it gets pretty powerful if you're in a bad position. But if he's confident that he can come out of it, then that allows him to push through what are undoubtedly some rather painful situations.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I guess we've covered off on the topic of muscle, and there's a number of different aspects to endurance, which I briefly mentioned earlier. But one thing I wanted to dive into today, Alex, was fuel. And I guess fuel is one of those things. I mean, I'm 34, and even in my relatively short life in the context of human history, have seen so much different literature on what you should eat, what you shouldn't eat, and it seems to be changing all the time. And now we've got this whole new school of thought that's become quite prevalent in the last few years, which is, the low carb, high fat movement, or the ketogenic movement. And your book actually explores this concept of should you carbo load versus should you have a high fat diet, and what are the implications of both? Can you last, say, a 4-hour marathon if you're just on 80% carbs and a strict ketogenic diet? So keen to explore some of the findings in this space, Alex.
Yeah, so obviously this is a huge topic, and what people are looking to get out of LCHF diets varies greatly from person to person. And so it's important to sort of think carefully about what specific claims you're trying to investigate. So in the context of endurance sport, like you said, things have changed dramatically, and there has been, I think, even skeptics of low carb, high fat diets would acknowledge that there has been a dramatic change in our understanding of what's possible on a low-fat diet. That 20 years ago, I think, or even 10 years ago, most researchers in this area would have said, if you try and run a marathon without carbohydrates, you are screwed. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just that's the fuel you need for running a marathon. And it took a lot of pushback and a lot of skepticism for some recent studies in the last few years and sort of personal experiences to show that actually, if you're well adapted to a low fat, a very low fat diet like a ketogenic diet, you can go out and run a marathon, and you can go out and run an ultra marathon, and you can do an Ironman triathlon while taking in very, very little in the way of food during the race. And that's a dramatic change. And I think we have to recognize that it's like, yeah, we know something new. There's some new knowledge. Now, with every new trend, there's always a range of of claims made for it, and there's always going to be the temptation to overstate what is possible or what is shown. So, I tend to hear a lot of claims saying that, well, actually, a ketogenic diet is the superior or the only or the right way of fueling yourself for, say, a marathon. And I don't think that claim has been shown. It's not impossible, but the fact is, when you switch to fat, you get a big advantage in terms of access to your body's fat stores, which are inexhaustible. And so that's a plus. But you give something up too. You give up your access. You don't have quite as good access to your carbohydrate stores, which are much more rapidly available for high-intensity exercise. So what they find, for example, is if you do a simulated Tour de France stage for cyclists, which is a lot of long, low-intensity exercises punctuated by some really intense sprints like breakaways or going up hills or end-of-race sprints. On the low-fat diet, you can get through the stage, no problem. You're going to do fine, but you're going to lose a few meters here and there on the breakaways and on the sprints, and that's when the race is won. So it turns out not to be really practical for Tour de France riders. And if you look at a marathon, at the Olympic level, that's relatively high intensity. So if you look down, for example, the all-time list of the marathon, the 100 fastest marathoners in history, 95 of them are from Kenya and Ethiopia. And if you look at studies of how Kenyan and Ethiopian marathoners eat, the Kenyans tend to eat about 95% of their calories from carbohydrate. 20% of that is just from plain old sugar that they put in their tea and put on their porridge. Ethiopians are similar, about 65% carbohydrate. So, until there's someone on a ketogenic diet who is in the top 1,000 all-time of marathoners, I think it's a stretch to say that this is a better way of doing it for performance. But like I was saying at the top, there's this larger context. Is it better for your health? Does it allow you to go for longer? Does it keep, without having to take fuel in? So if you're a mountaineer, it's like if you don't have to take as much fuel in your backpack, that's a huge advantage. And you might be willing to say, okay, I'm going to be, 3% slower if I have to sprint, but I'm going to carry, 15 pounds less food. That's a trade-off you're going to be willing to make. So the end of the story is, it's like, I don't think there's one we can reliably say is better than the other now. But what we can say now is that a low carb very low carb, high fat diet is an option that might in some contexts be the right option for some people.
Yeah. And it comes back to that magic word, context. And, you pointed out the Tour de France there, and the race is won and lost on those stretches up the hills and whatnot, and that may not be conducive to a low-carb diet. And you've also pointed to some research which I guess argues for the opposite in your book, which was an MIT medical researcher called Stephen Finney, who modeled or put some well-trained cyclists on a diet modeled by a research by somebody by the name of Stephenson. I haven't got his first name. And that diet was basically 83% of calories from fat, 15% from protein, and 2% from carbs. And he put these cyclists on this training program, and ultimately their VO2 max and performance in multi-hour time to exhaustion tests remained essentially unchanged. But that, I imagine, was just riding on a straight line as opposed to up and down hills.
Yeah, and so that this study is from the 1980s, and it's one of the sort of classic foundational texts that everyone points to and says, look, you can get away with low fat. But the really interesting thing is it was a tiny study of 5 people, but the conclusion that their performance stayed the same, that's the average performance. Some riders got way better, some got way worse. And so if you're the rider who got way better, this seems like the most brilliant dietary change in history, and you can't understand why everyone else doesn't want to do the same. But if you're the guy who got way worse, then it's the opposite. You're thinking, why is everyone saying this is wonderful? And so we have this sort of funny situation, and I think this is a feature of the human performance debates in like all domains, where something works for somebody and they're unable to comprehend that it might not work for other people, that their experience does not necessarily generalize. And so I think we, both scientists who are like, the average result says this, have to remember that some individuals may have positive or negative results that aren't reflected in the average. And those of us who are self-experimenting also have to remember that what's true for us, understand that other people may not experience the same thing as you.
Yeah, and it's funny, and you see this a lot in gyms where somebody who's been training for, say, 10 years, and, he's 300 pounds and shredded and all the rest of it, and he'll be giving advice to some upstart who's 150 pounds, and he's telling him, you should smash 4,000 calories a day, and 40% from carbs, 40% protein, 20% fat, and that kid's thinking, oh, that sounds like a lot of food, and he tries to do it, and it just doesn't work for him, because he's obviously a totally different person, and he's not been training, and he's not the same size, and there's so many factors that go into it, and I feel like so many people just look at what's working for them and just pass that on as advice to the next person.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the other aspect of that is that it's also easy to fool ourselves to try something, to think it works, and then to become an evangelist for that without sort of really rigorously evaluating whether did you do better this week just because you actually got more sleep rather than whatever other thing you were changing.
Yeah, and on that tricking the brain, I guess we see that a lot today. Whether or not it's legitimately tricking the brain or whether it's got a plausible effect, we see that within the cognitive enhancement community or the biohacking community, where people will take all manner of things, lion's mane, chaga, MCT oils, which in some cases have been shown to boost cognitive performance, but in many cases, and I remember having a conversation with Jamie Wheel on this who co-wrote Stephen Kotler's latest book, what was it? Not The Rise of Superman, the one that came after that, which I'll add to the show notes for our listeners. And he was basically saying they're more or less just spending money on very expensive piss. So your book explores this concept of placebos and how sometimes if something has a 1% benefit, adding, say, 20 things that are supposedly going to give you that added 1% doesn't necessarily give you an extra 20%. It still gives you, say, that 1 to 3% benefit.
Yeah, that's a really funny observation in the sports science literature, because of course everyone's looking for the supplement or the training change that can that can give their athletes a little edge. And there's very few things that reliably and predictably give an edge. A few things like caffeine, baking soda for certain kinds of events, beet juice for longer events. But what's frustrating for sports scientists, like you said, is that you take all these things, all of which have been shown to give, that 1 to 3%, and you add them together and you still get 1 to 3%. And so you have to conclude, well, maybe all of those things, which nominally have different physiological pathways, are kind of actually acting on the same thing, which is the brain. And of course, from a scientific perspective, you say, oh, well, that proves it's all a bunch of crap, that it's all a placebo effect. But the sort of realization in the sports performance literature is, well, hang on. If the guy still got 1 to 3% faster, let's not throw away the baby with the bathwater. So it's a placebo is a dirty word. Maybe we should be talking about belief effects. The idea that if you can convince yourself that something is going to help you, and it does, then kind of don't look a gift horse in the mouth. And this becomes a very slippery slope where you're like, well, okay, well, then we can start prescribing anything we want as long as we trick the athletes into thinking that it's real. And so I would not go that far, but I would say whatever you're doing, do your due diligence. Make sure there's a reason to think something is going to work. But then go into it with try and go into it with confidence and with faith, so that if you've done your due diligence, you can say, I'm pretty sure this is going to work. Then you can also harness the positive effects of believing that you're going to do something helpful for yourself.
And I guess just to explore some other aspects of expanding the limits. I mean, we've touched on a few things around purpose, placebo effect versus belief effect, but there's a whole range of things people can do. And, we often see fighters visualizing before fights or just as part of their training as to how that fight's going to pan out. Over the last few years, we've seen the upswing in the number of, say, mindfulness apps and blogs and books and everything else telling people just be present in the moment, don't run off into the future, don't be regretful about the past, and by being present you'll be able to perform in both the athletic and the, say, professional or corporate arena. What are some of the other things you've seen based on your research that people are doing to expand those limits?
Yeah, so one of the ones that kind of caught my attention because it's relatively simple and straightforward, and yet seems to be effective even in very carefully controlled lab tests, is self-talk. Is being aware of your internal monologue and altering it when necessary to make sure you're telling yourself something positive. So a pretty good example, there have been a number of studies, but one of the most recent ones was by a guy named Stephen Chung at the University of Brock in Canada, and he had cyclists do an endurance test in a heat chamber. And for half of the cyclists, he then gave them 2 weeks of self-talk training, which was very simple. It's the first step is you have to become aware of the words that are bouncing around in your head when you're in a stressful situation, because we all have an internal monologue, and it's usually, in a stressful situation, it's not a complicated monologue. It's usually pretty simple, like, this is, I'm going to screw up, or in a hot room, it might be, I'm boiling. Oh my God, this is hot. This is hot. It's just kind of echoing in your head. So you become aware, you write down the thoughts that are in your head, identify the ones that are problematic, and replace them with something else, like, I'm ready for this. I've trained for this. I'm ready for this. And it takes practice. You can't just sort of decide that that's what's going to echo in your head. You have to then practice a lot, making sure that in this situation, whether it's a work situation or an athletic situation, you in training, in practice, you're preparing yourself to have this positive self-talk. And then when you come to the test or the performance situation, it turns out that just basically what's happening is you're altering. So for the cyclists, they're not altering the temperature of their body. They're not altering their heart rate. They're not altering anything like that. But they're altering how their brain interprets those signals. And fundamentally, what our limits, what defines our limits is the point at which your brain decides that the signals from your body are telling it that you're pushing, to a dangerous point. So if you can change how your brain interprets those signals, then you can actually change the point at which you seem to reach your physical limits. And so in the case of this heat chamber study, the cyclists, they improved, after 2 weeks of self-talk training, they improved their time to exhaustion in this heat test from 8 minutes to 11 minutes. And more interestingly, they also were able to push their core temperature up by about 0.5 degrees Celsius. So this is a case where a relatively simple psychological intervention had measurable physiological effects. They could push farther and they could push a little deeper into their reserve. So whatever was holding them back the first time before self-talk training, it wasn't that their core temperature was too high, because they were able to push it higher later. It was that their brain was interpreting the core temperature as too high. So I would say self-talk is like, if I had a time machine and could go back to, and tell my 20-year-old self, here's what I've learned from a decade of research on, human limits and endurance, I would say, start with something simple. Start with something that good athletes have been doing for a long time, but maybe not everyone has been doing, which is, trying to control your internal monologue.
Yeah, it's just about that prolonged application as well, rather than today I'm going to be all positive and pump myself up, but that's probably not enough. You need to be doing that over an ongoing period of time to really solidify those beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not something you can necessarily just decide, because when the pressure's on, we tend to revert to sort of our autopilot systems. So you have to prepare to execute these sorts of strategies.
Yeah, and I think it can also apply to lots of things. It was last year when I ran this experiment where for 20 days I would not default to judging anyone based on anything, and I would have to catch myself before I judge someone. And after 20 days of that concerted effort, I just found myself judging people a lot less. So you can use that same sort of notion of self-talk to make yourself a better person in different aspects of your life as well.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, and it's definitely something that I'm sure the effects of that 20 days are still lingering for you, even if they're not as strong. But you could never have just decided to do that and woken up one morning and have it stick.
Yeah, you definitely need to be intentional about it. And obviously today, things like journaling and writing down your thoughts before you head out for your day or at the end of the day, and replacing those negative thoughts with positive ones, and what were you grateful for, and everything else can make you a more well-rounded person and one who embraces adversity and takes lessons out of those setbacks, which is very powerful. And I guess to take that whole concept of self-talk a step further, I had a conversation on the podcast yesterday morning with Jeremy Bailenson, who just wrote a book called Experience on Demand, which is basically about virtual reality, and he heads up the Stanford Virtual Reality Lab. That's not the actual name of it. It's like the Human Interaction Immersive Lab, something along those lines. And he's got a company called Striver, which is all about immersive learning and training in VR. And they're working with NFL teams and the German national football team. And ultimately, they're working with them to help them, say, model real game situations to aid decision-making and build confidence. So, have you had much exposure to this emerging field?
I haven't encountered the virtual reality stuff. There's definitely a lot of, a lot of interest in the ways we can use technology to help, enhance our brain processes. So one example that I experimented a little bit with and looked into the research is brain stimulation, electric brain stimulation, which is it's gotten a lot of attention for its potential cognitive benefits, its mood benefits, but also for extending its endurance benefits. And there's a Silicon Valley startup called Halo Neuroscience, which is selling headphones that trickle an electric current through your scalp. Now, my own personal experimentation, I do not have any hair on top of my head, and apparently the Canadian climate is harsh enough that my scalp has become quite tough, because I actually couldn't get proper electrical contact with between the headphones and my scalp, and it actually became very uncomfortable. I had to press these spikes into my head trying to make contact. So I ended up a little bit of a skeptic about that. both because of my own personal experiences and also because the research is still very preliminary. But I think what you're talking about and using enhanced environments to as a way of training the brain, to me that's a more satisfying way, a way of not of just trying to switch a button to change your brain's properties, but of actually developing your abilities through deliberate action over a long period of time.
Yeah. And I think it's probably just another tool in the arsenal. And I guess on that topic, there's so many tools that will be in place at any given time that it's potentially, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, hard to run a completely isolated experiment. Like, was it the shoes? Was it the gel? Was it the Selftalk? I mean, what was it that gave an athlete an edge in the last 1 mile of that race?
Yeah, absolutely, and especially. So I spent a lot of time last year covering this. There was a big attempt to run a sub 2-hour marathon that Nike spent tens of millions of dollars on, and it was exactly that situation where they were basically trying to pull every lever they could. And what ended up happening is Eliud Kipchoge, who's the Olympic marathon champion from Kenya, he ran a marathon, it wasn't a record. It didn't count for world record purposes because they had some extra pacers, but he ran 2 hours, 0 minutes and 25 seconds, which was this phenomenal performance, 2.5 minutes faster than the current world record. But at the end, everyone was left wondering, so, what was the secret? Like you said, was it the shoes? Was it the fuel? Was it was it Eliud Kipchoge? Is he just an incredibly unique individual?
Well, they even pointed to the Tesla pace car and the draft that it created.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a whole. There was a lot of controversy. Dueling scientific groups running aerodynamic simulations to prove that the Tesla did or didn't have an influence on the air resistance that Kipchoge faced. And the bottom line at the end of the day is we don't know. And realistically, when we're talking about peak performers, really like top performers in any domain, whether it's cognitive, or physical, you're never going to get the experience. You can't have a study of 50 Olympic champions because there's only one Olympic champion, and so you can never do this sort of repeated measures, double-blinded experiment for people at the top end of or people in a unique upper echelon of performance. So it's kind of you have to accept that there's always going to be some uncertainty and some guesswork and some artwork in this sort of performance enhancement, because it's very hard to as you say, to isolate the variables and to do repeatable experiments when you're talking about unique elite performers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess one thing I wanted to touch on, just because the majority of our audience wouldn't be professional athletes in the top of their sport. They'd be everyday people who are more or less gunning for success in the entrepreneurial realm or in the corporate realm. How much of their performance really comes back to the basics of exercise, sleep, and nutrition? I mean, is that going to get them 90% of the way? Yeah,
I think that's an important point. So I've spent the last 10 years kind of writing about the cutting edge of sports science and technology. And sometimes I feel a little guilty about that, because it kind of feels like, running a massive baking conglomerate that only sells icing. And it's like, well, the icing is nothing without the cake. You have to have the cake. And so, things like sleep. I wrote about some studies recently that looked into injury risk and connected it to really basic things, like if you're getting less than 7 hours of sleep a night, your injury risk is like quadruples or something like that. That it's just, you're not functioning at your best if you're not doing the basics, like eating well, getting fruits and vegetables, and getting sleep, and all these sorts of things. So I do think that's a really important thing to remember. But I also think, I guess, an illustration that I would give just of how important your mental outlook is. One of the things that blew my mind is the record for breath holding, and maybe maybe people in Australia are more aware of this just because you have ocean closer to you than I have to me. But so there's more freedivers around. But for listeners who don't know this, I would invite them in their heads right now to guess what the record for breath holding is, because it is 11 minutes and 35 seconds, and that's with no. This isn't like using pre-breathing pure oxygen or anything like that. Just the plain old pure breath hold record is 11 minutes and 35 seconds. And I had a chance to chat with a guy named Brandon Hendrickson recently, who just set the American record for breath holding, which is 8 minutes and 35 seconds. And what and I was asking him how it went down and how it felt. And he said, he hit the point that freedivers call the struggle phase after about 4 minutes. And that's the moment where almost all of us would quit, because you get these involuntary breathing movements where your breathing muscles are trying to force you to breathe. They're contracting involuntarily. And that's because it's not because you're out of oxygen. It's because your carbon dioxide levels in your blood have gotten high enough that you're getting these this warning signal, which to us feels like a physical limit. But to a trained freediver, they can ignore that. And so he was able to go, 4 minutes is when the yellow light came up where he felt like he hit his limit. 8 minutes and 35 seconds is how long he made it. So to me, that's kind of something that I try and remember when I feel like I've hit a wall in whatever capacity of my life. It's like there's a factor of 2 there between what feels like a limit and what the actual limit was. And even if you don't get all the way to the point where you run out of oxygen, which is what these freedivers can do, there's a tremendous amount of reserve that you can access with the right mindset.
Yeah, and sounds like you need to be from Northern Europe to pull this off. I know another guy who's known quite well for holding his breath is Wim Hof, who I think his record was 6 minutes holding his breath underwater. But a lot of that, again, is like partaking in these breathing exercises and working up to that, not just, hey, I'm just going to go hold my breath for 6 minutes underwater. And I think there's been a lot of people that have tried that after listening to his podcast, reading his book, and it's not ended up too well for them.
Oh, no.
So one final thing we might touch on, and then we'll jump into our 3-question lightning round, Alex, and that is training the brain. We talked about zapping the brain a few moments ago, and your book tells the story of Sara Isakovic, a Slovenian silver medal swimmer, Olympian silver medal swimmer. And she's been working with a neuroscientist and psychiatrist named Martin Paulus to identify the neural characteristics that separate elite endurance performers from the rest of us. We've touched on a few things today, but based on that research and based on Martin's work with Sarah, if they pulled out anything else that our audience would benefit from knowing.
Yeah, that's a great stream of research. And basically what they were doing is taking very elite performers across a variety of domains, from special forces troops and Olympic athletes, putting them in a brain scanner and subjecting them to a stressful situation, which was, in fact, they're breathing through a tube, and sometimes they constricted the flow of oxygen, so it became hard to breathe, and they were doing cognitive tests all this time. And what they were able to see in the brain scans is that the elite performers in the area of the brain that's monitoring the rest of their body and the external world, that's sort of keeping track, how do I feel, what's going on, the elite performers were always alert. They're always in tune with what's going on in their body. And when the stressful situation starts, when their breathing is restricted, they don't panic. To them, that's just information that, okay, yeah, now we realize there's this situation. Got to be aware of that and keep going. Whereas most of us, the normal people, had much lower levels of activation in this area of the brain, the insular cortex, that's monitoring signals from the rest of the world. We're just kind of whistling along, not paying attention, not aware of how we're feeling until there's a panic signal, and then we overreact, and then the activity in that area of the brain just spikes way up. And as a result, we perform worse under stress, whereas the elite performers, they actually improve their performance on the cognitive tests during the stressful situation because they enter this sort of hyper-aware state. So the takeaway from that, I think, they've been experimenting with different ways of helping people develop the elite brain activation patterns. And one thing they've tried, not surprisingly, you mentioned this earlier, mindfulness training, the sort of 8-week mindfulness courses that are very common around the world. They actually seem to help. They've done experiments with U.S. Marines prior to deployment overseas, giving people this 8-week mindfulness program, and they are able to kind of improve their ability to monitor the present state of awareness of their body and not to panic when things go wrong, just to treat that as information. So when you're under stress, it's not an alarm signal. It's just, okay, yeah, my heart is beating faster now because I'm standing in front of a room of important people and speaking to them. I'm not dying. That's just a physiological signal, and I don't need to panic. So I think mindfulness training is one thing, but the more general thing is just to be aware. The sort of the simple definition of mindfulness is non-judgmental awareness, and I think that's a principle that's really helpful to remember. That if you feel stressed, if you feel uncomfortable in the athletic context, if you feel your legs are tired, just treat that as information. You're aware of that. Yes, signal received. You're aware that the legs are hurting or that you're stressed and your heart is pounding, but you don't need to panic about it. And separating the input from the emotional response, I think, is a really crucial skill to develop.
Yeah, and not only in the athletic domain, but also in the workplace. There's actually an article in the current issue of Harvard Business Review. I think the lecturer's name was Moshe Cohen from Boston University's Questrom School of Business, and they were talking about going into negotiations and how you should be aware of your feelings, understanding those triggers that get you to, your palms get sweaty, your heart rate increases because they've said something you weren't expecting, but just to notice that and be aware of that and not let that dictate how you show up in that negotiation, and also being conscious of your adversary or your counterpart's emotional state at that time. Because obviously, and I think this goes back to ancient Greece and Socrates, emotions cloud judgment, and so the more aware you can become of them, the better you'll be in both the athletic domain and both in your professional life.
Yeah, and these obviously these things are deeply hardwired, and we can't just make them go away. But just being aware of them in a way disarms them, because you're no longer captive to this sort of this primitive response. If you see it happening and you understand, okay, yeah, I am tensing up. But it's not. That doesn't mean I have to immediately lash back with a vicious counteroffer or something like that. I can just let it pass and think about what's best for me tactically instead of acting on my reptile brain's worst instincts.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. And look, we've left the audience with a lot of value today. I think we have only started to scratch the surface of what's been covered in the book, Alex. So people should run out and get a copy of the book, and I'll add that to the show notes for our listeners. But before I let you go, we've got to throw you into the 3-question lightning round. So let's see how you perform in this one, Alex.
Oh yeah. I'm just sitting here with my palms getting sweaty and my throat constricting. But
all good.
Hit me.
I hope you had your MCT oil. So question number 1 is, if you could work for any organization at any stage of the company life cycle, so this could be, say, the Boston Celtics in the 50s, who would it be and why?
Oh, I have to say, Google 15 years ago would have been a lot of fun. You just have a sense of purpose and a sense of a lot of smart people having a ton of fun.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was back in the days of don't be evil, whereas now I think with being a listed company and everything else, it's a little bit hard not to be evil. So anyways, we'll leave that one there. And question number 2, Alex, is if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think I would like to talk to Roger Bannister, who is alive. But I'd like to, I'm sure it's hard for him to remember what he actually thought before the first 4-minute mile. So I'd like to actually go back in time and talk to him before the 4-minute mile and ask him whether he thought it was possible, and if so, what it would take.
Yeah, and Roger Bannister was going head-to-head with an Australian, right? John Landy.
That's true, and then that's a great one of the great tales of maybe mental barriers or maybe not. Who knows what was holding Landy back? He came so close and then broke it as soon as Bannister did.
Is what it is. And lucky last. I mean, we've been spending a good hour now talking about different ways to stretch the limits, both of mental and physical performance. And I imagine you've got a number of rituals and routines, Alex, to help you stay on top of your game. So what do they look like?
You know what, the number one is bread and butter, just like you referred to earlier. I just make sure I get outside usually for a run pretty much every day. And that doesn't mean, I'm a former competitive runner, but sometimes my run is 15 minutes of slow jog. But no matter what the circumstances, my day is infinitely better if I get my heart moving and I get outside for a brief period of time. So that would definitely be my number one. And number two, honestly, I feel so boring. I almost want to hit myself. But to me, time in bed for sleeping is just crucial, and I try to make sure I get a minimum of 8 hours per night. And the third thing, I guess, the more unusual thing, sometimes it's getting untenable. But I would say on my mobile phone, I have talk and I have text, but I do not have data because it is really difficult to. It's not because I don't think it would be useful to be able to check my email at any moment of the day. It's because I know it would be so useful that I would do it all the time, and I don't want to set myself up to be having to use my willpower not to constantly check my email. So I can choose to check my email. It just costs me $5 on a pay-as-you-go basis. So I've made that decision to have no data on my mobile phone.
It's like a swear jar kind of thing.
Exactly.
That's perfect. Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff out there now. And you mentioned before our chat the conversation I had with Adam Alter a couple of weeks ago. So if people are interested in finding more about the topic of tech addiction, check out that episode. So people can pick up a copy of the book on Amazon. They can find out more about you at alexhutchinson.net. They can read your articles over at Runner's World, outsideonline.com. You've also been published in a number of other reputable publications like the New York Times and so on. They can hit you up on Twitter at Sweat Science, which is just an epic Twitter handle. Is there anywhere else people should go, Alex, to find out a little bit more about yourself and connect?
I think that you've hit the highlights. I would say Sweat Science, the Twitter page is probably the best place to sort of keep up with whatever new is going on. I do have a Facebook page, Sweat Science 1, but I think Twitter's the place to go, and alexhutchinson.net is if you want to discover further details of my sordid past.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Alex, for your time today. You've been an awesome guest, left us with a lot of value, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Steve. Really thought-provoking conversation. I appreciate it.
Cheers. Hi guys, Steve again. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to discuss episodes like this one, request guests for new episodes, propose questions, and access exclusive podcast-related content, join the brand new Future Squared Facebook group. Just search for the Future Squared group on Facebook or visit bit.ly/Future Squared group. That's bit.ly/Future Squared group. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, please take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Google Play. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. This episode was powered by Collective Campus. Until next time, Future Squared is out.